Getting your garden planted early does not necessarily mean you're getting a head start on the season. It is so common to hear gardeners say, get your garden in the ground so that you get a head start. But that doesn't always mean you're getting a head start. Hey there, I'm Audrey Crawford, and I'm a California gardener in Zone 9. I teach you the tried and true methods of gardening in our climate and break down complicated gardening advice into simple and actionable steps so that you can take action and grow your best garden yet. This is the Audrey's Little Farm Show. So, when you see others rushing to get their garden planted, does it make you feel behind or make you feel like you suddenly have to get everything planted? It's what I like to call gardening FOMO, which is the fear of missing out. I've definitely felt that way before, but I've learned to be a bit more patient over the years, which has led to much better gardening results because when you plant your warm season garden too fast, it oftentimes causes a lot more harm than good. And so in today's show, I'm going to be covering all the details, and I'm really excited because I'm going to be covering a lot of really great information that applies to this time of year, which if you're listening in real time is mid-April, and if you're listening at another time, you can always apply this to future gardens. So there are a few reasons why the idea of this show actually came to mind. The first is because I recently was in a gardening group on Facebook, and I saw a question from a new gardener who was in a town close by, and so I knew I could give him or her some pretty good advice because we have very similar weather. We're only about 45 minutes apart. And so they had mentioned that they had planted their garden 4 weeks prior, so I'm guessing around early March, and in those 4 weeks they had barely seen any growth. They had planted beans and a squash, and of all the plants they planted, they only had one squash germinate and 2 beans. And the beans were also turning yellow. So their concern was why this was happening, if they should replant or just continue waiting. And before I go over the tips and advice, I've got to read you some of the answers because this poor gardener, was a first-time gardener. They mentioned that in their question, but they really got some really poor advice. They also got a few great tips, but I just hope this is a clear sign as to why you should approach gardening groups with caution, especially on Facebook. You get gardeners from all over, and a lot of them I'm sure mean well, but I see a lot of really bad answers out there, and so just a word of caution. So the first response was somebody saying that it's likely too cold still and the ground isn't warm enough, which is a really great answer and some of my exact thoughts. But of course, this is going to depend on where you live. So the answer wouldn't be the same for everybody. The next person told them that they need to water daily and feed bi-weekly, which is not good advice. The frequency of watering varies based on so many factors, and feeding or not feeding your plants is not going to help a germination issue. Of course, healthy soil is key to healthy plant growth, and feeding your plants throughout the season is great for, continued plant health, but germination has nothing to do with feeding your plants. It has to do with temperature and with temperature and moisture. Somebody else told them that they need more sunshine. Again, not great advice because the lack of sunshine isn't a cause for poor germination. If your plants had already germinated and they were getting leggy and searching for sun, then of course more sunshine would be great. But the fact that most of the seeds hadn't germinated at all was not due to a lack of sunshine. Anyways, my point in reading all of these answers to you is to just point out that gardening is very localized. And so the best thing you can do is learn how plants grow and what causes your plants to grow healthy throughout the season, what causes them to germinate properly, the timing of planting, all the things that go into growing healthy plants, versus just taking one's advice and planting on a specific date because they told you to plant on a specific date. And so once you learn sort of the science behind gardening, such as how plants grow, what they need to thrive, the seasons that they should be planted in, then you're going to be able to apply it to your garden no matter what the season is because you'll know what those plants require. Unless somebody lives in the same exact town as you and is experiencing the same weather, it's very unlikely that the answer they would give you is going to be what you need. But since I'm very close to this gardener who asked the question, it was very clear to me what the issue was. So in early March here in Central California, we had a few really warm days, and if the weather had stayed that way, I would have got all of my warm season crops planted. But as you looked at the future forecast, there was still rain and many cool days in the low 60s and nights still in the 40s. So I continued to hold off planting all of my warm season crops, knowing that they wouldn't grow great if I planted them so soon with all of that rain and the cooler days. So initially I thought I would plant towards the end of March, maybe the beginning of April. But then this last week, we had a day that was in the 80s, and the very next day, it dropped down into the 50s and it was raining. So I was really glad that I continued to hold off. And so the reason that this gardener was having germination issues is because it really hasn't been very warm. We've been having some sporadic warm days, but like I mentioned, we've been having sporadic cool days too. And for successful germination, warm season crops need soil that is at least 70 degrees or warmer. And that doesn't mean that they won't germinate at a cooler soil temperature, but for best success and optimal germination, they need 70 degrees or 70 degree soil or warmer. And the reason for their green bean plants turning yellow is likely from all of the rain that we've been getting. They were probably a little bit overwatered. So the key takeaway from this specific story is that March and April can be very unpredictable months here in Central California, as well as many other parts of the United States. So holding off to plant your warm season crops is not a bad thing, because then you kind of skip that real unpredictable weather, and you don't have to worry about your young seedlings getting damaged from the rain or the wind, whatever it might be. And so just because your average frost date might be March 1st, for example, does not mean that you need to go out and plant all of your warm season crops on March 1st. You have to look ahead and plant when the weather is actually favorable. Remember that first and last frost dates are based on averages. It doesn't mean that that's what's going to happen year after year. And even if you don't have frost in the forecast, doesn't mean that the weather is actually warm enough for optimal plant growth. When you plant warm season crops too early, you're really not getting a head start. Even though seeds will likely still germinate and the plants will still survive, they're going to be very slow growing until the weather is warm enough. And so they're pretty much just going to be stagnant out in the garden. And I've even heard of many gardeners having stunted plant growth the entire season when they've planted things too early. This isn't true for all warm season crops, but I've heard this pretty frequently from gardeners having this problem with their peppers. So when they've planted their peppers too soon, they've had stunted growth the entire season. And so it's never harmful to hold off. And that leads me to my next frustration, which is one of the other reasons why I wanted to record today's episode. And that is gardeners that put out videos saying to plant these crops in March and these crops in April, etc. I'm sure you've seen them. They're very common on YouTube. And even though many of them are very helpful, and from experienced gardeners, it is not great advice, because it's going to vary depending on where you live. It's going to depend on your weather. And so you really have to take that information with a grain of salt. If you're told to plant green beans in March, but the weather is so cold and there's rain in the forecast, you're much better off to wait. However, for some gardeners, March might be a perfect month to plant green beans. So you really just have to listen to the advice and take what you can, but then let go of the stuff that doesn't really apply to you in that moment. You always need to look at the weather. Another thing I've been hearing lately in the online space is gardeners saying to plant early so that you get a head start. But like I've mentioned, planting early does not necessarily mean you're getting a head start, especially if the weather isn't favorable for plant growth at that time. The same is true if you plant cool season crops right now as the weather is starting to warm up. If the weather is not favorable for cool season crops to grow, which cool season crops thrive in temperatures about 50 to 70, then they are not going to grow healthy. They're likely going to bolt and head to seed. So here in Central California or any other warm area, spring is usually not a great time for your cool season crops, because they will just bolt and head to seed. There's not enough cool days in the forecast for those crops to fully mature and thrive. However, one thing I would love to encourage you to try out this year is a cut and come again garden. I first heard about this from Renee Shepard, who is the founder of Renee's Garden Seed Company. I'll be sure to link to her site in the show notes, because she's one of my favorite seed suppliers. But anyways, like I mentioned, cool season crops don't grow well when the weather's warming up. But with a cut and come again garden, you sow baby mixed lettuce varieties, spinach, cilantro, and other leafy greens by seed out in the garden, but you harvest them when they're young, about 4 to 5 inches tall. And you leave just about an inch stub at the base, and then you reseed often so that you have a continuous supply of fresh greens coming up. So you're going to continue harvesting the older bunch, and you'll probably get about 3 harvests out of it, but then you're always going to have fresh young greens ready, and you're just going to keep that cycle going throughout the entire season. So it's a really great way to get a continuous supply of fresh greens all throughout the year, even in months when the weather isn't really favorable for those cooler season crops. The beauty of vegetables like leafy greens is that they is that you don't have to wait until something fully matures like you would want to with a head of cauliflower. You can harvest the plants young, which allows you to pretty much just get a year-round crop out of them, depending on where you live. So you can just harvest young, harvest often, and reseed often, and you'll have great success. So I hope this episode was helpful. If you have not got your garden planted yet, don't feel behind. You have plenty of time. Or if you did plant too soon and you experienced some plant issues, you can probably now figure out what the issue probably was. And so as I look ahead to our weather forecast, we have pretty much all warm days coming up, and so it's going to be a great week for me to get my warm season crops in the ground. And in next week's episode, I'll be sharing everything that I'm planting. So if you want to hear about all that I'm growing and maybe get some inspiration for your garden, be sure to listen to next week's episode. And in the Zone 9 Garden Club, I will be doing an April garden tour and teaching, plus I have the April planting calendar already up in the group. So if you'd like to start a 14-day free trial, just head to the show notes below and you can start that 14-day free trial and check out all the resources in the membership and then be a part of the upcoming garden tour and teaching. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Audrey's Little Farm Show. I would really appreciate if you would rate and subscribe to the podcast. It really helps other gardeners find the show, especially since we're new at the time of recording this. And for more information and to get a free planting schedule that I created for you, just head to the show notes below, and I will see you in the next episode.